So in this video, we're going to talk about JetBrains remote development. Now, I'm not going to do a big deep dive on this. There's various different hosting options, and I'm just going to show the WSL option because that's the easiest just to demo and have a play around with. And to describe this, first of all, I'll start on their website, then we'll do a demo. So this is jetbrains.com/remote development, and scrolling down, it talks about the advantages of it. But before I talk about this, if we scroll down a bit further, so we can look at what it actually is. So the idea is that locally you can run quite a thin UI front end, and the IDE's backend is run remotely. And this has quite a few different benefits. One of them is that you might have a laptop that's on the go, and it might not be the most powerful machine in the world. You can then have a really powerful backend if your software is doing more heavy lifting. Another benefit is security. If you've got your laptop on the go and you're traveling, when you're using remote development, the source code is kept remotely. So you've not got the source code on your own machine. So if you lose the laptop, that's not got the source code on it. So from a security point of view, that's a big win. If we go back up again, I think this said the advantages. So we've spoken about keeping your code secure. We've spoken about the hardware side of things, so you don't have to worry about your laptop freezing or overheating, and you can overcome the limits of your local hardware. Another benefit is things like onboarding. So when you're onboarding new developers and the initial setup of your development environment. So as I mentioned before, locally you're just running a thin client called JetBrains Client. If I scroll down a bit, it supports these IDEs, including Rider. If we go down a bit more, JetBrains Gateway is basically the entry point desktop application, and I'll explain this when we demo it very shortly. From the backend point of view, so you've got different options for the backend, and one of these backend options used to be JetBrains Spaces, which has actually been discontinued this year. So like CI/CD pipelines, Git repositories, package management repositories, it was that kind of system, and it also supported this, but that has actually been discontinued early this year. The JetBrains option seems to be JetBrains Code Canvas, so if I open that up in a new tab, this is basically their CDE environment, and it can work as a backend for remote development. If I scroll down a bit, it just talks about requesting a demo rather than trying it now. So I'm not going to demo this as part of this video. Instead, I'm going to use the WSL option. If I go back to the other tab, there's some other options like Google Cloud Workspaces, GitHub Codespaces. Now for this, in GitHub Codespaces, you can set up an SSH server. So you do that, and then you'd use JetBrains Remote Development to connect to that SSH server. And there's other options as well, like Gitpod and Coda. If I open up JetBrains Toolbox, then I actually have quite a few updates, but let's ignore that for now. This must be quite recent. I've got this gateway option here. If you've not got it installed, then you can install it here. I'm going to double click. So that's now launched JetBrains Gateway. Let's move that over here. And we can see here we've got these options: Connect to Code Canvas, which we saw before, WSL, which I'm going to show very shortly. You can do an SSH connection. So you'd use this for GitHub Codespaces, for example. You can connect to dev containers with Docker. Gitpod we saw before, so you can install a provider, and Google Cloud. These are ones which, well, we can see them in the background here, and Coda as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect to WSL. Now I've mentioned WSL, but I've not actually said what it is. It stands for Windows Subsystem for Linux, and this allows you to install Linux distros on Windows, and it's very heavily integrated, so it's quite powerful. Obviously, if you're using Rider on the Mac, you won't have this option, but you can still use the other options. So if I say connect to WSL, then it gives me a drop down to choose my WSL distro, so I'll go with this one. Note that this is a WSL distro that I've already got installed. I'm going to click next. So this is now connected to my WSL instance, and it will search for what JetBrains IDs are installed on it. And if it's not already installed, then I can tell it to download the latest. It will do it automatically for me. So for time's sake, I've already got it to install Rider. Now note that this is on the remote server, so on my WSL distro instance. And also note that this is the IDE backend. So on the front end, which is on my host machine, we'll be running the thin JetBrains client, but remotely it's going to be installing JetBrains Rider. So that's already installed, so I'm going to select that. I need to say what solution will be remotely loaded. So if I click on ... then I can browse my remote host, and I've actually already copied onto Ubuntu in my home folder code this performance module. So this was the project we're looking at in the performance module in this course, and it's got an SLN file in, so I'll do OK, and then start IDE and connect. So this is starting the IDE on the back end, And we can see that's running on the back end now. If we give it a bit longer, it'll launch the front end JetBrains client. So there's a couple of things to point out here. First of all, it really pained me to do this, but I uninstalled JetBrains Rider before recording this video because I wanted to show that this is not JetBrains Rider, even though it looks like it. It's got the icon here in my taskbar, which you won't be able to see at the bottom. It's got the JetBrains Rider logo. If I right click on there and right click here and do properties, then we can see that this is the JetBrains client, even though the description says JetBrains Rider. If I actually click on my Rider bookmark, then we can see that Rider isn't actually on this machine because I've uninstalled it. But we get the same kind of feel. I can expand this, I can expand that, we can browse the code. We can see on the top left, we've got this Ubuntu here. Let me just maximize this, there we are. We've got Ubuntu here on the top left, and it shows information of the backend. So we can see CPU load and memory, but this is on the remote host. We've got ports, you can do port forwarding, we've got output, and we've got settings as well. Also, if I hover the mouse over one of the tabs, we can see that the path is actually on the remote Ubuntu distro. It's not natively on my machine. So we can see here that we can edit the code from my machine using this lightweight client. But what about running it? So let's click play. We can see it's a Linux path. Obviously nowadays .NET runs cross-platform, so it does run in Linux. If I just do the CPU profiling, so it does that Fibonacci, and that's now completed that, all running remotely on the Linux distro. So let's stop that. If I go to the tests and then run this, then we've got a failure. And this is when we intentionally made it break when we're testing something earlier on in the course. So let's get rid of that and then run it again. There we are. So we can see we can run tests as well. So even though we're using a thin client here, I'm not really noticing an experience difference when coding compared to if I was using the full Rider, just developing locally as normal. So that now marks the end of this penultimate module. In the next module, we're going to look at a series of short videos just going through standalone Rider features. So see you there.